I had never heard of Alice Paul before I started researching for this project. So I was very surprised to learn about her and to learn about all of the amazing things that she did for the women's movement. And it really left me, wondering why had I never encountered her before.
I did not know about Alice Paul before we started researching this play. I, like so many other people I've spoken to, have never heard of Alice Paul or Lucy Burns. I had heard of Ida B. Wells, but I didn't really know a lot about her until we started this research. We knew that the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified was coming up, and started to do research with that idea in mind, not knowing where this was going to go. As the research started to come about, we realized, oh my goodness, there was a parade, and did you know the people that spearheaded the parade were Alice Paul and Lucy Burns? That led us to the website for the Alice Paul Institute.
Equal Rights Amendment activists saw this place and it was offered to them, will you somehow save this house and grounds and do something in Alice Paul's honor? And everyone agreed to make this a living memorial to Alice Paul's work. Make it a place where her work for equality can continue.
So we decided to sign up for a tour. So it was our playwright, myself, and our costume designer. And we all went for the very first time to the Alice Paul Institute and saw Alice's home, and they had a wonderful video that explains a bit, and the volunteer showed us around the house and showed some different artifacts that had belonged to Alice, and tons of photos.
The 12 Reasons Why Women Should Vote, that pamphlet was hanging on the wall. I almost felt like I wished I could have planted myself there and written the play there.
Alice Paul's name has gotten such recognition in this anniversary, and I think that's really because she speaks to a contemporary audience. She's younger than many of the suffragists, than our image of suffrage. We think of Susan B. Anthony with the little tight white bun and the wire rim glasses, and here's this 28-year-old, who's just a kid on many levels. And she took to the streets. Her methods speak to the modern audience, and they were radical back then.
I honestly did not know who Alice Paul was until a couple years ago. I was an intern here at the Alice Paul Institute in my senior year of college. I was getting my law and justice degree, and I had to have an internship, and luckily Alice Paul tops the list because her name starts with A, and that is how I found out about her, and immediately she became very important to me.
We have just a few things from when Alice Paul's estate, when she was the last of the 4 siblings in her family to live. So she probably had the few artifacts from the family that came to her. This is a picture of her with her mother, a baby picture, and it's symbolic that we would have this because she and her mother were very close until her mother's death in 1930. She was really one of Alice's biggest supporters, and her mother in many ways is an inspiration to her. Her mother did introduce her to suffrage. She was a member of the local suffrage club and took Alice along to meetings.
Alice went to her father one day and said, I don't like being squished up in the wagon. There was no school bus, of course, in the late 1800s, but they had a wagon that would come around and get the kids. And she said, "Can I take my horse?" And he said, "Yes, that's fine." So she would ride her horse. The lane that comes up now, the driveway, went straight into town.
Her mother's fondest wish was that each of her 4 children would attend Swarthmore for at least a year to experience Quaker higher education. And Alice did attend Swarthmore for all 4 years and graduated. Here's her degree, and she graduated from Swarthmore in 1905 with a degree in biology. after women won the vote, she felt she really needed to understand the law. So just like all of us, she went to law school. And over the course of the next 7 years earned 3 degrees in law, a bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in law. This is a picture of her for one of her other mentors. She's at the grave of Susan B. Anthony. This is in 1923 in Rochester, New York, and she was in the area because the next day she went up on the pulpit of the church in Seneca Falls to announce the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment was originally named the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
She never knew anything but equality of the sexes. And so when she went out into the world after she graduated and she started seeing some of the struggles through her social work, she couldn't really believe that it was an issue because she didn't know. She didn't know that there was a difference. And that influenced the work for the rest of her life. The most significant part of her Quakerism and the bridge to her activism was the nonviolent aspect of Quakerism. She held that through every aspect of her fight. And even as a now dubbed a militant suffragist, she, through all of the protests, through everything, nonviolence was what she wanted. She wanted to be known not as an activist that took anything too far because of her roots, because she was a Quaker.
Can you tell us the difference between suffragist and suffragette?
Right. Suffragette was a term given to the women in England. I'm not sure what they called them here in America before that, but I assume suffragist. But in England, they started calling them suffragettes as a diminutive term, as a criticism, and the women there decided to take it as a badge of honor. So they called themselves suffragettes. And here in America, looking at the English movement, which was quite violent, really. These women were getting beaten in the streets and dragged, and Alice Paul's letters home would talk about her wearing every article of clothing she owned before she went out to a march, knowing that she was going to get hit and beat. So she'd have multiple clothes and coats on to protect her body as padding. They would go out, she said, like stuffed sausages. They could hardly move because they had so much, they were wearing so many clothes. So everything that got reported here in the States focused on the violence of the suffrage movement and the suffragettes in England. So that became associated with the idea of militancy and violence. So when Alice Paul came back to the States and got involved in the suffrage movement here, she and the other women were very careful to use the word suffragist to distinguish from that. They wanted to make the point that there is no need for any violence in our movement. And they never did pursue any violence, and it was much less violent than that in England. But eventually, when the women ended up in jail and hunger striking, I don't know that that qualifies as nonviolent so much. But that's the whole difference between a suffragist and a suffragette.
Alice Paul went to England to continue her studies, and while she was there, she took part in their suffrage movement and was jailed. And when she got out of jail, she received one of these Jailed for Freedom pins as a memento of her time in jail. Then she came back to the United States and started her work here for the suffrage movement. And as you know from watching the film, Alice was also jailed here in the United States. And upon release, she made 168 of these as mementos for the other women that were also jailed with her.
Suffrage was a household word before 1913. People knew about it and talked about it. From the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, that started this whole long run for suffrage. Really, Alice brought the national light back to it. in the 1913 parade. She had just come to Washington, D.C. and knew that she had to pull this off the day before the inauguration because people were in town to welcome President Wilson. And the media was all around, and so this was the perfect plan to gather national attention and be on the front page of the news. And it worked. It worked.
Alice Paul was 28 years old when she organized this parade, and I find that to be really incredible because I think back to myself at 28 and I was just sort of trying to figure out what to do with my life, honestly, and she not only knew what her path in life was going to be, but she was tenacious. She came in and she ordered around people that were much older than she was, and she really believed that she had it in her to do this big thing.
At first it went really well. At first there was 8,000, 10,000 people marching in the parade. And as the afternoon went on, though, there was definitely some hecklers. Some people were dragged out of the parade and beaten, and there was hospitalizations. Through this all, though, they persisted and kept the route and made it all the way down.
I first discovered the Silent Sentinels. I thought they kind of stood out. It was really the first time that anyone had protested in that way in front of the gates of the White House. It's a very striking image to be standing there in a line with the banners, not saying anything. And they were there all day, 6 days a week, no matter what the weather, for a year.
The play itself, we had a grant from Hudson County Cultural Affairs and also worked very closely with Jersey City Cultural Affairs because we were able to perform that play for the first time at the Apple Tree House, and it was site-specific. We were able to have the audience walk through the historic home, following the actors along the way.
So the way that I write it, it's to be done, very specifically at this site. And so what we were able to do is we have the audience follow the action. And that way they can see the grounds of the house and inside the house while they're also watching the show. So they're not stationary. So honestly, to that interaction really would cover moments when audience were moving from one place to another. So it just made that flow of traffic more natural. And it also, for a play in general, we have the beginning where Lucy Burns is handing out pamphlets and she's talking to people. And, obviously we don't have the budget, or it's not really necessary in a play where you're just going to have a couple crowd, passersby going back and forth. And, she could pretend who she's talking to. But why do that when you have an audience, standing right there? So she was able, we kind of wrote that where she was actually talking then to audience members. But actually, and our director at the time, Michaela Kafka, she was really kind of, she shaped that as well. So I had these words written, I had this character, but she really, worked with the actresses to, make sure that you're focusing on the audience at this time. And, and it really just adds something.
My role in researching for what I did with the Apple Tree House was less focused so much on Alice Paul directly for me, and more focused on pulling together the people that could research her and her era in very specific ways. So Jenny Contuzzi did that in a really deliberate and applied way through portraying Alice Paul both as the young and old, which I thought was such a mesmerizing approach to storytelling, both as a reflective and in the moment way that Votes for Women and the film do quite well. We were able to allocate some direct funds from the Action Grant to contribute to a mosaic that was a collaborative piece that was spearheaded by Heather Wall of Speranza Theater Company that aimed to bring together this kind of collective making moment. And now we have this beautiful relic. It mimicked things that women in the era of women's rights and in this protest moment in the 1900s, that kind of collectivism and building up of pieces commemorating identity or goals.
Again, when we were at the Alice Paul Institute, they had this quote by Alice where she likens the women's suffrage movement to a mosaic. She never took credit for her action. She never thought of herself as a leader of the movement. So the mosaic quote, to paraphrase, is I think of the movement as a kind of mosaic. Everybody puts in a single stone, and at the end you have this beautiful mosaic. In the film, I kind of embellished the quote a little bit to make it a little, but okay. So you have this beautiful mosaic. And so we thought, well, again, because of the interactive nature of being at the Apple Tree House, we had this idea, wouldn't it be cool if we made this mosaic and we had audience come and so that they're actually placing stones, onto this community mosaic, and then at the end, when it was finished, we would give it to the Apple Tree House. Also saying to the audience, by being here, by witnessing this, you are contributing to Alice's memory, Alice's, vision of what the world could be, so all of that.
So when COVID happened, Speranza had to take a moment to reevaluate what was happening. We had an entire tour planned for Votes for Women inside theaters around the state, and we weren't able to do that. So we did have a wonderful opportunity because of Jersey City. We were afforded the opportunity to perform in parks around all 6 wards of Jersey City and even 2 parks into Hudson County as well. 8 performances in total in parks in Hudson County. We also had the opportunity to expand our audience multiple times over, in fact, because we added a live stream to every single performance at the parks. So not only did we have people live adhering to COVID guidelines in the parks in person, but we were also able to reach people all over the country and in fact the world that we would not have reached otherwise. So then the idea moving forward was, okay, let's see if we can get the whole thing as a film.
The play had its own shape when I came onto the project. They had been performing it, it had been beautifully done all over the summer in parks in Jersey City and in Hudson County. So the actors really had ownership of the story and a beautiful rhythm that the stage director had already established. So it's an exciting thing to take a play like this and turn it into a film.
Seeing my play adapted to film was a pretty great experience. I was thrilled to be able to have that opportunity. It's not, it's a rare one.
I love the way that Jenny has chosen to articulate this story in her play. When I looked at how does this play transfer to film, there were a lot of questions that came up, and Jenny was a really collaborative partner in helping me form my vision for the film while also honoring her vision of the play.
No, and it's interesting because I do think, film is more of a director's medium. Like the director is a storyteller in film, and in theater, like the playwright is the storyteller. So I really, I wasn't necessarily looking at it as like, oh, my play is being filmed. It's like, this is the film, and, Diana, our film director, was fantastic. And, she always would come to me and say, oh, do you mind if I change this? Or might not quite, work the way it was working in the stage version. So can we? And, I try to be very open and adaptable because, I think that ultimately it's what she's seeing, behind that lens. That's the storyteller.
One of the themes or ideas in the film that spoke to me a lot, that I really wanted to be pivotal in adapting this play to a film, is the idea of a mosaic. And what I tried to do in the film was have these moments within the film where you see close-ups of different items, of people's hands, of different things, so that you remember those pieces, and all those pieces come together to tell the story. And the line of the film is you create something beautiful and lasting. And that's what I hope this film does, that it takes this story and helps it have a legacy, that lots of people see it and that it has a lasting effect.
As we were in planning process, I had the thought of what if we could perform this at the place where Alice Paul grew up, at the Alice Paul Institute. And without knowing if they were going to say yes or not, I reached out, and luckily they did say yes. They were excited to have us, and the rest is history. What was Alice Paul's vision?
I think the quote on the wall really says it all, that there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality, that from there all reforms can happen if you start with the bedrock belief, as she did, that everyone is equal.
Alice Paul's personality really resonated with me because of her tenaciousness, her persistence, her strength. She was kind of like, wasn't always liked, honestly, because it was all about that goal of equality. And so she really didn't have the time to be nice.
She actually introduced the ERA in 1923 at the Seneca Falls Convention, and it was introduced in Congress every year after that. Through 1943, when originally Alice had called it the Lucretia Mott Amendment in honor of Lucretia Mott. And in 1943, it was rewritten just a little bit. She changed the wording, and it became the Alice Paul Amendment, or the Equal Rights Amendment. And in 1972, it finally passed both houses of Congress. It, however, did have an addendum attached to it that gave it a 7-year time limit to be amended by the states. And that, unfortunately, fell short. She never put down her mantle. She would not let anyone come visit her without them contacting their representatives in Congress and telling them that they needed to vote for the ERA.
We were lucky enough to get to visit Alice Paul's gravesite, which is not too far from her home. And there are all these beautiful flowers there. Other people had come to visit the gravesite. And a lot of the family plots were also very close to Alice as well. So it was inspiring to be able to see how so many years after her death, she's still, I'm going to use the word again, inspiring other women.
Why did we not learn about Alice Paul when we learned about the suffrage movement? So much time was spent on general ideas and other things that the people, the women, who sacrificed so much of their lives for this cause, we just don't know their names. We don't know their journeys. We don't know their stories. So to be able to tell this story about Alice Paul, to be able to introduce her to other people who may not have heard of her, who may not have met her through their studies, for me has been a gift.
As long as Alice Paul is not a household name, is not part of textbooks that we learn about in US history, we can't stop. We can't stop trying to get the word out about Alice and letting people know this important part of our history.
I feel like working on this piece and researching her just made me more aware of the importance of standing by your voice and not letting people make you think that, you're not important or what you have to say isn't important.
I think it's important for all of us to remember that we have that capacity. It's hard. It's hard. Sometimes we think our voices don't matter, our votes don't count, but they do, and we have to keep voting and making ourselves heard so that the choices that are made in our government represent the things that are important to all of us.
We're really lucky to be able to have this be a film because we are able to reach a much larger audience than we ever could have by doing these school assemblies, which we will still do post-COVID, but this just afforded us an opportunity that we would not have imagined was in the reality for a theater company. And I think there are a couple of things that I would like young people, young women in particular, to take away from this, seeing this film, that their voices matter and to never stop trying. Just like Alice Paul, once the 19th Amendment, that goal that was passed, it was ratified, she moved right on to the next goal, which was still in line with her first goal. It was really all about equality for her. So just to keep going, your voices matter, and don't give up.